Let's say a high-profile, democratically elected political figure lies routinely. Let's say the people around that person also lie, frequently and openly, and that their supporters, too, take up those lies. Should something, somehow, be done to stop them? Cass Sunstein is the Robert Walmsley University professor at Harvard and author most recently of Liars, Falsehoods and Free Speech in an Age of Deception. And he joins us now from the U.S. Capitol on why he argues that, in general, lies should not be censored or regulated. Cass Sunstein, it's good to have you on the program again. How are you doing?
Great, pleasure to be here.
Not at all. Given that you're in Washington, perhaps it's reasonable for us to start by invoking the name of Daniel Patrick Moynihan, that great senator who once said everyone's entitled to his own opinion, but not to his own facts. Now, given the landscape in your country these days, is it fair to say not too many people are listening to that advice?
Well, I think people think that they are truthful about facts, most of them, not all. And so they believe they're saying what's not false, but often they are saying falsehoods.
Right now, a lot of people in your country are shouting falsely, fire, in a crowded movie theater. You talk about this in the book. Why so many and why now?
Well, there are a couple of reasons. One, of course, is the proliferation of outlets in which you can find things that are false. So if you go on Twitter or Facebook, or if you go on a website, you can hear things about Martians or about pandemics that aren't true, or about other members of the human species that are false. So it's just so easy to find falsehoods. And often, if you hear something that's false from someone you believe to be credible, it might be your neighbor, might be a politician you trust, you'll believe it because you don't have access to independent confirmation or disconfirmation.
There is still, however, I would suggest in the United States, maybe more than any other country in the world, a true commitment to free speech. Why do you think that is?
Well, it goes back a long time. So in our country, there was a rebellion against the United Kingdom, England, and part of the rebellion was, hey, we are born free and equal, and we get to say what we want. The freedom of speech is part of our cultural heritage, and that's a very good thing. The Civil War, the attack on slavery was partly promoted and entrenched a belief that people should be able to dissent, even from institutions and practices that have been longstanding. Certainly, the civil rights movement of the 1960s entrenched further a commitment to freedom of speech, and that is part of our culture, but we shouldn't exaggerate the commitment to freedom of speech. If someone perjures themselves, if someone says, I'll sell you this product, you'll never get cancer, if someone tells you, hey, I saw my neighbor and my neighbor was stealing drugs from someone else who was another neighbor who was using drugs, if that's false, that can be regulated too. So our basic commitment to freedom of speech does have some limits.
Well, you do give this example in the book about the time you went to buy a car and the fella who sold you the car said, oh, I'm going to give you such a sweetheart deal because we never sell cars on Saturday. And then he gave you the sweetheart deal, you bought the car, you asked him about it, and he said, oh, God, we do our best business on Saturdays, so of course. Now, that's not a... Sorry, go ahead.
He was a great car seller. He said... No, it's Saturday. I'm not going to sell any cars. I'm going to give you a spectacular deal. And he gave me a deal which probably wasn't spectacular at all. But since he had prefaced it by saying, we don't sell any cars on Saturday, I thought to myself, lucky me, he's giving me a great bargain. And then an hour later, when I drove the car off, I said, I'm glad I could sell you a car on Saturday. He said, you kidding? He forgot what he had told me an hour earlier. He said, you kidding? Saturday's our best day. I'm going to sell 30 cars today. He was a good car seller and a liar.
He was a good seller and a liar, but of course, this sort of gets into this issue about some lies which are serious and problematic, and some which aren't that much. Which category would you put that one in?
I think that was more like trying to make me be well inclined to buy a car from him. It wasn't fraud, it wasn't damaging, it wasn't wonderful. It didn't make me like him more, but it was within the bounds. If he had told me, buy this car, it has better gas mileage than the record shows, and you're not going to pay anything for gas, that would have been fraud. If he told me something about safety features that was false, that would have been fraud. If you told me something about how if I use this car, I would never get heart disease because the car has spectacular anti-heart disease magic, that wouldn't have been credible. So maybe it wouldn't have been fraud, but it would have been worse than what he did.
Well, of course, it all raises questions about whether or not you can regulate lies and falsehoods while at the same time fostering free speech. And let me just read this short excerpt from your book and then come back at you with a question. My first goal here, you write, is to deepen the foundations of what many people find to be a jarring idea. In general, falsehoods ought not to be censored or regulated, even if they are lies. Free societies protect them. Public officials should not be allowed to act as the truth police. A key reason is that we cannot trust officials to separate truth from falsehood. Their own judgments are unreliable, and their own biases get in the way. If officials are licensed to punish falsehoods, they will end up punishing dissent. This notion of trying to find an unbiased censor who can make the important judgments about what's okay and what's not, is this the prime reason why you think we should just sort of let outright lies and falsehoods go?
Well, I'm not really quite there in terms of letting outright falsehoods and lies go. I aim to write the book as a kind of manifesto in favor of regulating lies and many falsehoods. So I started the book thinking we have this horrific problem in democracies even of lies and falsehoods causing terrible harm, and we ought to do something about that. The more I worked on the book, the more I thought the idea that this was a manifesto in favor of protecting against lies and falsehoods was too simple, and hence the passage you read, where the idea that goes back to John Stuart Mill and John Milton of allowing a lot of breathing space for falsehoods, even if they're intentional lies, that's actually a good idea. So to have that abstract commitment to freedom of speech, even if someone says, let's say on a date, I won a medal, I was the greatest track star in high school. Or if they say, if they're running for office, I was first in my class, when actually they weren't first in their class. To say that can be deemed a criminal offense, we wouldn't want that in a free society, and we wouldn't want to live in a society that isn't a free society. Still, the part of my motivation, which was to say we need to do more than we now do to control damaging falsehoods and lies, that is a thrust of the book. So the book, it's a little like music, where it has a theme and a counter theme. The theme is freedom is important. If you ban lies and falsehoods, good luck maintaining freedom and democracy. At the same time, if you say anything goes, you can lie however you want, then we're in big, big trouble. And we are in big, big trouble. So the balance between the theme and the counter theme is what gives the book, I hope, a productive tension.
Indeed it does. Can I just sort of drill a little deeper here on this issue of which lies and which falsehoods you find cross the line and are particularly problematic?
Well, the first thing you want to know is how dangerous is it? So if someone says on a date, I was a track star, then the person you're dating might like you a little bit more or not, but nothing horrible is likely to happen. If you say to a friend that, you know what, let's go swimming, it's going to be a beautiful day, and you kind of know it's going to get cold and rainy, don't make that a crime. It's not so harmful. But if you sell a product saying this product has all sorts of medicinal properties which it actually lacks, or if you sell people a product lying about certain character safety features it actually has, that's harmful. Then people are going to get hurt, really hurt, possibly more than hurt, possibly killed. And that can be regulated. If you have a politician who says things about his or her background that's kind of an exaggeration, then let the free market work on that. But if you have someone that actually says that my opponent is, let's say, a former felon who spent 5 years in jail, that's a more interesting case. I'm not sure whether that should be regulable, but you could devise a case when we're talking about libel under standard North American standards. And the idea that libel can be regulated that seems compatible with a system of free expression, depending again on the definition. Health and safety are two categories of falsehoods and lies where the harm is large enough and the danger is serious enough that to think about regulation is not a terrible idea.
In which category would you put Donald Trump's comments that the election was stolen from him?
I think that shouldn't be regulated. We're talking about a political actor. It shouldn't be regulated by government. We're talking about a political actor who is saying something which I believe he knows to be false. Still, to regulate that, to say he's committed a crime by lying about the election, that way lies a kind of madness by which we are criminalizing the lies and falsehoods of political officials, and that doesn't really have a very good heritage. On the other hand, for Facebook and Twitter, and this is a large part of the book, for Facebook and Twitter to take down lies from politicians in cases like that, that's very thinkable, and it doesn't pose the same kind of danger that is posed when the prosecutor starts wielding the criminal law against people.
Do I hear you saying then that you do not think it problematic that Donald Trump had his Twitter account shut down?
I think that is not a horrific problem in a free society where private entities, including Twitter and newspapers and magazines, are allowed to do a lot of stuff that fits their own conception of what their role in society is. So I'm not sure I approve of that, but I do think it's within the domain of the reasonable. And for Twitter and Facebook to be thinking really hard about such things as warnings, reminders, putting things in context, putting a big word on certain statements, and that word is false. That's a good thing for freedom. That's not a bad thing for freedom. And for taking down things that cause imminent risks, as Facebook does, risks of harm, that's a good thing. And since Facebook, as powerful as it isn't the government, it legitimately has more freedom to maneuver than a government would in protecting against the adverse effects of lies.
How troubled are you, though, that Donald Trump has had his Twitter privileges taken away, but the head of al-Qaeda or the head of ISIS still manages to hang on to his?
Well, exactly what line should be drawn would require lots of immersion in particular facts. And to think about how to deal with one political leader or another is completely fair. To have an offhand judgment would be reckless. What I would say is that we know what our theory should be. It should ask the following kinds of questions. How much harm is being done by the speech? Is it an intentional falsehood or an innocent falsehood? How corrective would be counter speech, meaning how useful would counter speech be? Typically it is. And how imminent is the harm? And how grave is the harm? That's the kind of questions we want to ask. And we're talking about a terrorist leader who's recruiting activity for terrorism. The idea of allowing that on a private platform, that's not a very good idea. Not necessarily because it's false, it may or may not contain a falsehood, but because it's dangerous and private entities do well to reduce risks of danger.
What about the speech Donald Trump gave on the 6th of January near Capitol Hill? What category would you put that in terms of harm caused and therefore needed to be censored, regulated, whatever?
I'd put that speech in the category of worse than bad and dangerous and life-threatening. Whether we should at the time think of a president of the United States who's making statements like that as a basis for, let's say, at the time, criminal intervention is extremely doubtful. Whether after the fact, criminal inquiry is legitimate or not would depend a lot on particulars. I want to give any politician a wide berth with respect to statements to supporters. Whether the president passed the bounds of what is legitimate, you'd want to know a lot about what the particular statute says, and you'd want to know a lot about the context. But a very strong presumption in favor of allowing statements, even worse than bad statements by political leaders.
It's interesting that it was probably 8 decades ago that Winston Churchill said, a lie can get halfway around the world by the time the truth has a chance to put its pants on. And obviously, this is well before the days of digital communications and social media. That is really the case and on steroids today. I wonder whether or how all of that affects your thinking about this issue.
Yes. So I am less pro freedom of speech than the Supreme Court is today. That is, certain libels that are not under current standards punishable by damage actions, I would allow punishment by damage actions. So if someone says something that is false and damaging to reputation, to say that that person has to say it was wrong or has to pay a small amount of money, seems to me that's within the bounds of what's acceptable in a free society. And many nations that are highly respectful of freedom of speech very much agree with me on this. So it is true that the speed of damaging falsehoods, saying someone is a criminal, someone is a horrible actor, and not like bad in movies, but a horrible person. That is unprecedented. And it's also the case we know something about the human mind that Churchill didn't know, which is that if you were told something, and if I tell you in real time that what I just told you is false, you will, in some part of your mind, remember it as true, even weeks and months later. It's called truth bias, and it casts, I think, a new light on a lot of what we're discussing, where a statement that is false gets under the kind of skin or the surface of the human mind, and that makes it particularly damaging, where even people who know on reflection that it's false, in some part of their mind think, oh, that's true. And that puts a special burden, I think, on social media platforms and others, not simply to label things false, but to take the most damaging ones down. And it also puts the whole area of libel in a somewhat different light from the light in which we've looked at it over the last few decades.
So if I were to say Cass Sunstein is certainly not a Toronto Raptors fan, just by saying that alone and putting Sunstein and Raptors in the same sentence, I've really violated you there, haven't I?
Not so terribly, because I'm a Raptors fan. Admittedly, that is a terrible, terrible thing, but it's not the very worst thing in the world. If you said Cass Sunstein doesn't like the Boston Red Sox, I think that would be unquestionably libelous and a terrible thing. And I much regret that I uttered that sentence, because some people will remember it as true, even though I said it to illustrate a point.
I will try to disabuse them of the notion from here on forward, because we know it is just not the case. Let's play a short clip here. This is from Timothy Snyder, well-known Yale historian. We're going to play this clip and then come back and chat. Sheldon, if you would.
We have to say, look, factuality doesn't arrive naturally, and this is a revelation of the 21st century too. We would like to think that the free market, normal human exchange will make the facts rise to the top, but it doesn't. That just isn't true. I mean, there's a long tradition in liberal thinking which says, hey, let's just have a free exchange, the truth will always win. It doesn't. We have to say, look, if you want truth, you have to create it. You have to manufacture it.
This is a very disappointing notion that the truth maybe will not out in the end. What's your view on whether he's right that Sunshine's just not going to get the job done anymore?
He's partly right. We've succeeded in coming up with vaccines to help with the pandemic, and that's partly a tribute to at least the scientific marketplace of ideas. We have, with respect to any number of technological developments, truth has won out that this makes for a good iPhone or a good laptop, and that doesn't. With respect to many things that people now believe that are true about how to make yourself healthy or safe, the marketplace of ideas has not worked terribly. So the course of human history is not like the marketplace of ideas stinks or it fails, but the idea that it is universally reliable, or we can count on it to correct damaging falsehoods, that is a truthful statement. I think what's nice is the truth of that statement is increasingly supported in the marketplace of ideas. And I don't know if that's testimony to the statement or a contradiction of the statement.
I'm going to take advantage of this opportunity to get your advice on something, because I know that on my own personal Facebook page, I promoted some months ago an interview I had with a doctor on the issue of vaccines and so on. And some anti-vaxxer, QAnon type of person said something, quite ridiculous on my page. And I immediately got an email from a doctor who said, Steve, you got to take that down. Take that comment out. And I had one of those Cass Sunstein moments where I thought, what do I do here? Do I censor, or do I hope that truth will be the best sunshine will be the best disinfectant? What should I have done?
I think for you as a public figure, a statement that is false and potentially damaging, to take that down would be a terrible thing. I think either to allow it up or to take it down would be reasonable. If you were the government and you were trying to put someone in jail because they made what, let's say, is just an innocent mistake, that would be a terrible thing. But to take it down, if your assessment is that it could be harmful, you're a private citizen, that's one way you could exercise your freedom.
For the record, I left it up and I just contradicted it. That's what I chose to do. Cass Sunstein, we're really grateful that you came on tonight's program. Liars, Falsehood and Free Speech in an Age of Deception is your latest contribution to this issue, and we're delighted to have had you on TVO tonight. Many thanks.
Thanks. A great pleasure.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA Ontario is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario. And by viewers like you. Thank you.